Handing over to you.
Okay, thank you. Right, so my name's Pippa, Pippa McKeown, and I tweet at Miss McKay Says. I've been teaching, as I said, for about 10 years now, and I've taught in a pretty diverse range of schools. So when I say diverse, I mean in every way, really. So in terms of geography, age of the students, culture, languages spoken, but particularly, I'd say, socioeconomically. And what I found is that there are some approaches and some tasks that work for every kind of student. And these tend to be, at their core, the tasks that assume the best of students, not naively, but kind of willingly. So adults who are open to students having and enjoying real success, whatever that success looks like for those students. You'll see, especially at the moment on social media, lots of people asking questions about lesson one and asking for advice about how to start. And sometimes that comes from a place of wanting to be a bit more creative, mix it up a little bit. And sometimes it's from a place of anxiety. I'm a lot of years into teaching and I know the students at my school pretty well, but I still get quite nervous in that first lesson, particularly if that's in September. So this lesson is a really useful tool for a smooth start that I think is reassuring for everybody. It's obviously quite timely because although this is something that I do every year, this year is going to be like no other. So a reassuring, calm start is, I think, immensely valuable this year. The one proviso of this lesson is that it requires students to be able to write. So they need to be old enough to do that independently. If you have students who have a TA or as a scribe, you might want to chat this through with the TA in advance to see if they want to work privately, if they want to share anything personal in what we're about to discuss. But I've used it with different age groups, different achievement levels, and in the different school contexts that I've mentioned. And it's worked at the beginning of the year, it's worked mid-year. I think it's worked probably for all but maybe 2 students in the whole time that I've been teaching. So we all know, and we've discussed a lot this morning in a very encouraging way, the importance of relationships. And some of that comes from first impressions, I think, particularly with classes that you haven't met before. My feeling is that the first lesson with a new class is an opportunity, if done carefully, to set up the relationship you want with that class. And in some senses, to really fast forward that relationship. I suspect if we look at the idea that relationships are at the core of any really effective teaching, as Emma so beautifully explained, I think, this first lesson for me is always the foundation for that relationship. I found that lots of teachers will say that they dive straight into teaching a topic at the beginning of the year because they don't want to waste time. But for me, the time that's lost in terms of a unit of teaching in this one lesson is worth it because of what's gained and what is fast forwarded in terms of the relationship that will underpin every bit of teaching from then on in. So let's get started. I structure my first lesson with any class, whether I know them or not, around 3 stages: routines and resources, resolutions, and relationship. Underpinning all 3 of the stages is absolutely regimented organisation. Part of the benefit of that is, for me, I know exactly what's coming, and that's reassuring if I'm feeling nervous, but it's also reassuring, I think, for students who can very quickly come to see you as dependable, organised and calm. That's been especially independent for SEND students that I have taught in the past, but I think this year, more than ever, that sense of calm and being prepared for anything is going to be invaluable for all sorts of students. So if we start with routines and resources, this is all pretty straightforward. For me, standards and expectations start outside the classroom by waiting for them to line up in silence. Obviously, social distancing allowing, you might want to do that in the classroom this year. It doesn't need to be done in a fashion that appears extremely strict, but as a teacher, I'm sure you'll know you'd never ever talk over the students. So waiting for quiet at this point sets that standard clearly. I explain they're going to be in a seating plan whilst I learn their names, which is the real reason. And then I display it on the board so that as they come in, they feel reassured, they've heard their name, they see where they're sitting, and they can also see on the board. And then they sit down, I go through the register again to check they're in the right place and to fill in the register and get them to get out their equipment before we go through their the resources that they need. So I then go through the admin. So it's done quickly, it's out of the way at the beginning of the lesson, and we can dedicate the rest of the lesson to the stages that I think are more valuable. I display the resources on the screen, and I think it's been really important. Experience tells me that the title on the board needs to match the title that's on the page or the screen for them. If the students are mischievous, they'll use that as an opportunity to mess around. And if they are not, they tend to get a little bit stressed if they can't find the right page. So it helps everybody, I think, to feel reassured if it's on the board. And then we go to page 1. So I ask them really prescriptively to lay out their page like this. I go through reminding them of capital letters. I remind them to underline with a ruler. I insist on which side of the page the date goes on. And these aren't things that I really care about. But I think it's useful for the students to have clear instructions and consistent high expectations. I've had a lot of students actually tell me they found this really reassuring because they knew exactly what they were writing, where they were writing it, and how they were expected to do it. Particularly with Year 7, this also tends to avoid some of the, sorry, I don't know what's going on with my presentation. This tends to avoid some of the should I leave a line questions that crop up. So next, after we've done that, and it's all very clear, we move on to resolutions. And this is really where the relationship building begins. I ask students to write a side heading titled resolutions, and for the younger students, I then ask if anybody has heard that word before or knows what it means. I explain that September is the start of a brand new year for all of us, and that gives us the literal and metaphorical opportunity for a blank page and starting afresh. I ask students to decide 3 or 4 resolutions for themselves and ask them to write these down. And I model some examples, so I'll just pause for a second and you can have a look at those examples. I emphasise that they should be realistic and measurable. So not just I'll be better at, but something specific. If you use SMART targets, that's basically what you're aiming for. For me, it's really, really important that it might be about something they're already doing, or it might be about changing something. I think for a lesson, it needs to be something subject related. If I was doing that in tutor time, I might make it extracurricular, but not for a lesson. The importance of the resolutions is threefold, really. Firstly, it allows me to remind the students that this is a fresh start, whether or not we know each other. So even if it's a class I'm taking through or have taught in the past, I will still say, we are different now. And I think particularly after lockdown, we've had different experiences. So this is a fresh start. We're back. It's as new as they want it to be, really. And I think that's really, it offers them an opportunity to be hopeful about what they want to do and reinvent themselves if they want to. Secondly, it allows them to take pride in the things that they do well and that we as teachers might not have noticed or might not even know. I think sometimes we can get distracted by solving the problems or trying to deal with students that we know are struggling. And that's really important for the students who always do the right thing, but without any fanfare, to have an opportunity to be able to say, well, I always do my homework on time, or I'm consistently polite. And it's a good reminder, I find, to recognise that and remember how important it is. And then thirdly, it gives a platform for discussion if things don't go quite to plan at any point during the year. So I've been able to sit with a student and say, okay, you said you'd like to improve this and it's not quite working out yet. So what can we do together to work on this? And because they can see it in their own handwriting, I think there's a different kind of conversation that comes from that evidence, if you like. I've even discussed it with parents and students together, and it results in a less didactic conversation, I think, because the resolution has come from the student. They're the one that said it's achievable, rather than it being from me or from the school, something that's kind of imposed. And then stage 3 is the key bit of the relationships. And for me, that comes in the form of a letter. It's a way of fast tracking the bond, really, by giving you a quick insight into the student's thoughts and feelings, and by making sure that you have an opportunity to respond to that. If you've watched any of the other presentations, you'll have heard how much the idea of treating the children as individuals and listening to their story is important. And this letter is a way of making sure that you hear their unfiltered story, their voice, rather than something that has been filtered through adults very well-meaning adults, but it might be other teachers through notes, it might be parents through conversations, but this is a way of hearing their voice and their story. So I outline what they need to include in the letter and remind them that they are the expert in terms of talking about themselves, so they should have plenty to say. I again model what I might include at each stage, but offering them freedom to include what they think is important. Number 3 here, tell me anything else you feel I should know, is the most important one to model, because sometimes they can be really factual unless you encourage them to talk about how they feel about certain things. So I suggest they might want to tell me they've always loved reading, or that they hate reading aloud in front of other people. Perhaps that they've been tested for dyslexia, but the results came back and said they weren't dyslexic, but it's something that concerns them, or they'd like to enjoy the subject more than they have in the past. And that should be something that encourages them to share the things that they consider important. It's along the lines of what Emma was talking about with something I wish my teacher knew, but it's the more developed version of that. I then mentioned that I would like to see their best effort with literacy, but I emphasise that is so that I know where we're starting from, rather than with anything to do with a grade. I don't record a grade or anything like that. Now, I'm saying that as an English teacher, but I have been a whole school literacy coordinator in the past, and I'd really emphasise that literacy is for every subject. So I do think it's important to remind them to do their best in terms of literacy. The key thing then is to acknowledge that you're interested in the literacy, but that it's absolutely not the priority, and you're far more interested about the content, who they are and what they want you to know. A key element of this task is making sure that there's fast turnaround for feedback. And that's the one, I suppose, downside if you want to look at it like that. But I have to say, they're such a pleasure to read that I really look forward to marking them. They are my favourite thing to read every year without fail. I'd emphasise that in terms of literacy feedback, I keep that really light touch, maybe one spelling error or one repeated error I might highlight. But because this is an exercise in trust, really, it's far more important that you're responding to the content of what's being said. So I tend to, in writing, so little comments all the way through, acknowledge their worries, thank them for being open, and say I look forward to hearing about the dogs they've mentioned, or that I know the sibling they've referred to. I might say how impressed I am by a sporting achievement or whatever. If they've told me anything about lockdown, I'll comment on that. But I'm also going to give the option of not talking about lockdown, because some of them have had an experience that they're fine with and they want to move on. But honestly, it's just an absolute joy to read them. So that's it. Routines and resources, resolutions and relationship. Dismiss them calmly and quietly by name if you're feeling really ambitious about remembering them. And hopefully this will give you some options for a warm, open, efficient start to the year and a chance to build bonds with the students that you're going to be teaching. And that's it.
That was super. Absolutely fantastic. And what I really like is Miss Brace has put down here, we're doing this activity with our year 5s for their first writing lesson. And it is an idea that translates into primary, because actually you can do it with your reception children. You know, you can ask them, they may not, you know, the average reception child will not be coming in writing, but actually, you know, drawing something or role playing, you know, something about them, just building up that literacy language base from a really early stage. And you can carry on that right the way through primary. And it does, you're completely right. It's the trust and the building relationships. Absolutely love Emma. As everyone else, sorry, Pippa. Called you Emma.
Sorry, we blended nicely, I thought, Emma's idea.
You blended like perfectly, and that you kept mentioning Emma. I blame you for me.
No, quite, yeah.
But no, you had so many fantastic, comments. You know, this is a great idea. Do you model a letter first? That was one of the questions.
Only verbally. So because I'm looking at it from a secondary point of view, they often say to me, how should you lay out a letter? And I say, well, you just give it a go and we'll see what's right. And then in the following lesson, I'll display one and they can just decide for themselves if they've laid it out properly. But I think modeling the comments is important. So the example I usually use is from a student a few years ago who included the fact, he said, P.S. I also have a lizard called Keith, which I just thought was the most enjoyable pet name I think I'd ever heard. But I think it's important that they can tell you the fun stuff that makes them who they are. and the things that they care about. And there's enormous value in, I think it's natural that all of us will remember the thing that we're particularly interested in. And for me, it's dogs. And often I'll be able to sort of pick out, oh, and you have a such and such dog, or, oh, and I look forward to hearing about the puppy that you've got, or whatever. And, you know, I think they feel seen, to say something a little bit cheesy. I think they feel seen by somebody who doesn't necessarily know them, but they feel they've then been able to share who they are without there being any filtering from any other adults, which, you know, I think at the age of 12, you can get a bit fed up of everything being paraphrased by adults and being represented by adults.
Completely. And I think the thing you mentioned about animals is great, because children love talking about animals. They adore talking, writing about their animal, just as adults do. You know, if you have an animal and someone gets onto animals, you're passionate about sharing what your animal is. I've got 2 cats, by the way. Yeah. But I think it's just that way of connecting. Pippa, you have been an absolute star on here today. Thank you so much. You can now go and breathe. And
thank you.
Relax.